Phase 6 is here, and some classes are literally unstoppable, while others feel like Blizzard forgot to hit the buff button. Did your class make it into the broken tier, or are you stuck in the trash zone? Today I'm going to break down exactly which classes are dominating and getting all the raid invites, and which ones are crying into their DPS meters. Trust me, some of you are not gonna like what I have to say. Before we get started though, let me know in the comments what class you're playing in Phase 6, and do you think it's as overpowered or as weak as everybody's saying? Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the Dominator classes that are carrying in Phase 6. First, we've got to mention that Ele Shamans are on a completely different planet right now. You've probably noticed Ele Shamans topping the meters in your raids, and it's really hard to ignore them on fights like Bug Trio, even Cthulhu. Their single target damage has really jumped up massively, and there's even a conspiracy afoot too. See, Shaman AoE damage is so absurd right now, but you won't even see all of it tracked in Warcraft logs. Luckily, we've got the sim data that tells us the potential of Ele Shaman AoE. It's so insane, especially when you have up to 5 targets. You could be pulling over 13,000 damage per second. Really, if you don't have multiple Ele Shamans in your groups in Phase 6, are you even playing the phase right? Meanwhile, the Warlocks, the Mages, they are laughing their way to the top. Affliction locks, Demonology locks, they're blasting so hard, and they're incredibly valuable on some of the most difficult fights like Cthulhu. And it's so easy to get a raid spot on a Warlock as well. Of course, they've got the amazing curses, but also the fact that no raid would ever start inside without the Warlock summons there to carry everybody. Mages, meanwhile, they're bringing huge AoE alongside Warlocks, and Frost is even more viable than ever, bringing crazy damage on fights like Huron. And I know Mage players, you're all very skilled, great at the game, but the recent buffs have been carrying you harder than a GDKP stack. Another class carrying in Phase 6 though, it's the Rogues. The Mutilate Rogue, the Backstab Rogue, the Saber Slash Rogue. They're excelling at nearly every single fight, Twin M, Scarab, Fenris. They only really struggle a little bit on some of the very melee unfriendly fights like Sartura. Rogues though, they were expected to do well. The bigger surprise is those big blasting boomkins. Don't look now, but they are actually pumping in this phase, typically top 4, top 5 on pretty much every fight. Turns out that Starfire and Wrath spam, it just isn't a meme anymore, and maybe the real star of Phase 6 is Starfire. Do you guys think these classes deserve to be at the top of the DPS meters though, or is Blizzard playing favorites? Drop your favorite conspiracy theories below now. So now let's talk about the Fallen, the classes being left behind. So you might think everybody's doing great, but not so fast. First, we've got to talk about Warriors. Warriors went from the Phase 1 kings to the Phase 6 benchwarmers. Is it skill, or did Blizzard just nerf them into the dirt? Well, actually the gear is a very big problem. For one thing, a lot of your gear is very competitive, very hard to obtain. But also Warriors rely very heavily on world buffs. At least until recently, AQ was so hard that very few raids were actually completing with everybody having world buffs. Even with full world buffs though, even with full BIS, the rotation, it just isn't hitting like it used to, at least compared to specs like Mages and Rogues too. Meanwhile, Hunters have really come on hard times. They're not the shiny, amazing class everybody wanted to have back in the early phases like Phase 3. They've got pretty low utility, you don't have to stack Hunters. There are tons of other classes that bring huge AoE to the table too, so that's not nearly as much of a perk anymore either. The bigger problem though is the middle of the pack single target damage. Hunter mains, I know you're going to defend your class in the comments, but the meters, they really don't lie. And I know Shadow Priest, they're still trying their best out there, but we've got to face it, nobody has called a Shadow Priest overpowered since Phase 2. You can point me to all those different sims and say Shadow Priests are insanely good on longer fights, but then you look at an insanely long fight like Twin M's, and they are below average, they're middle of the pack, nothing special. So now let's talk about my DPS tier list, and we're going all the way from those S tier broken classes, all the way to the D tier with the regretful classes. Starting out in the S tier, we've got to cover those Ele Shamans. They are the kings of AoE, and the numbers are frankly lying on just how overpowered they are. Then we've got the Warlocks, the Affliction, the Demonology. Bring as many as you can for insane AoE, insane single target, and the best utility in the game. Rogues, they have to be factored into the S tier as well. They're bringing wild damage on fights like Twin M's, and maybe they aren't necessarily the best on fights like Cthulhu, but still, rogues are insanely strong. In the A tier, we've got to start with mages, and fire mages are definitely hot, but frost mages, they might be even hotter. We'll also have to be launching off a few moonfires to celebrate the balanced druids. They're bringing their awesome utility alongside above average damage on pretty much every fight. Everybody is always going to want to have as many balanced druids in their raid as possible, and if you were thinking of a class to reroll, this is a very good choice. Next to those balanced druids though, we've got to include pharaohs. They are the favorite class of all alliance players, but horde players love them too. At least until they steal your Jam-Gabar. Come on, druids. Moving into the B tier, we've got those hunters. And yes, everybody brings AoE to the table now, which makes hunters a lot less special. But other classes bring even more utility too. I'll still be playing my hunter ult, but they are far from the kings they used to be inside. Also in the B tier, we've got to talk those enhanced shamans. Sure, it sounds really fun to play enhanced with Dark Edge of Insanity, Jam-Gabar, full Biss, but there are so many players competing for all that loot, and until you get it, you're really gonna be on the struggle train. Then in that C tier, we've got the Ret Paladin. Giving credit where credit's due, Rets are really good on some fights like Twin M's, and their AoE damage is definitely being undercounted. But there are so many fights where Rets underperform this phase, and they just really don't shine. Now going into the D tier, we've got Warriors. Two-hander, full Biss, Dark Edge of Insanity, well, middle of the pack DPS. Or you could dual wield with your shiny new rank 14 weapons, middle of the pack DPS. It's such a far cry from 2004 where getting that kind of gear, getting those items, would have resulted in chart-topping damage. Now the real bottom though is taken up by the Shadow Priests. Every single phase the Shadow Priests dream of being kings of the meters, but instead they end up being old reliable. They're always a very solid addition to any roster, but unfortunately they never quite bring the damage or the scaling they hope for. So this is my Phase 6 DPS tier list, but I really want to hear about yours. Where do you place your class and where do you place everybody else too? Drop your own DPS tier list in the comments and tell me why I'm right or completely wrong. If you're playing one of those really weaker classes though, what is your experience in Phase 6? Are you managing to outperform or are you still struggling like the rest of us? Ultimately, Phase 6 is incredibly chaotic, and the class balance has never been crazier. Whether you're dominating the meters or trying to convince your raid leader to give you another chance, the question remains, is Blizzard getting things right, or are some of the classes just doomed this phase? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I am reading every single one of them. Now, if you enjoyed this breakdown and you want to see even more tier lists, class guides, spicy Phase 6 content, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss what's next. Trust me guys, there is so much more coming. And for all you Ele Shamans out there, enjoy your throne while it lasts.